Everyone thought she was just a maid. But the billionaire standing in the doorway of his own mansion was about to discover the most painful secret of his life, one that would shatter everything he believed about his family, his fortune, and the daughter he thought he knew. Hello friends, welcome to Stories by Jason. Before we start, please do not forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. Also, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The private jet touched down at 2:47 in the afternoon, 3 days ahead of schedule. Richard Calloway hadn't told anyone he was coming home early. That was intentional. After 26 years of building Calloway Global Industries into a $3 billion empire, Richard had learned that the most revealing thing a man could do was arrive before he was expected. Deals were won that way. Lies were exposed that way. Employees who coasted when the boss was overseas had a way of revealing their true selves in the unguarded moments between Thursday and the Monday they expected him back. He didn't do it out of paranoia. He did it out of habit, out of the cold, practiced instinct of a man who had been burned enough times to stop being surprised by fire. The estate was exactly as it always was from the outside, a sprawling Georgian manor set behind iron gates on 14 acres of perfectly maintained Connecticut countryside. The hedgerows were trimmed to mathematical precision. The circular driveway curved around a marble fountain, its water catching the pale October light and scattering it like broken glass. Richard had bought this estate 17 years ago, when Sophia was just 6 years old, and he still remembered how she had run laughing through these grounds, her dark hair flying behind her, calling to him to watch, Daddy, watch me run. He hadn't thought about that memory in a long time. He told his driver to take the rest of the day off, carried his own bag to the front door, a habit from lean years he'd never bothered to shed, and let himself in with his key. The house was quiet. Greta, his head of household staff, had not been alerted to his return. The usual choreography of a prepared welcome, flowers refreshed, lights adjusted, his preferred scotch poured, was absent. He moved through the marble foyer alone, past the curved staircase, and turned toward the east corridor that led to the kitchen, thinking absently about coffee. He heard the sound before he saw her. A soft rhythmic scrubbing, methodical, patient. Richard paused in the corridor doorway. The kitchen was flooded with afternoon light from the tall windows overlooking the herb garden. It was a large, professional-grade kitchen, all stainless steel and white marble, and kneeling on the stone floor near the island was a young woman in a gray uniform, scrubbing the grout between the tiles with a small brush. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a white cap. Her head was down, shoulders moving steadily with each stroke. Richard frowned. He didn't recognize her. The household staff rotated occasionally. Greta managed all of that, and it wasn't unusual for there to be faces he hadn't yet catalogued. He was about to turn away to find Greta and announce himself when something stopped him. Something about the way she moved. He couldn't name it at first. It was the quality of stillness in the motion, not the blank, efficient stillness of a career domestic worker, but something more deliberate, more contained. Like someone performing a task with great concentration precisely to avoid something else, to avoid thinking, to avoid breaking apart. He knew that quality. He had worn it himself in the worst years of his life. "Excuse me," he said. The young woman scrubbing stopped. She did not immediately look up. "I don't believe we've met," he continued, stepping into the kitchen. I know who you are." Her voice hit him like a hand against the chest. He knew that voice. He had known it since it was a small, piping, 6-year-old voice calling to him across a lawn. He had known it through its adolescent changes, its confident teenage declarations, its last cold, furious words to him 2 years ago across a dinner table that now seemed like it belonged to someone else's life. The young woman slowly put down her brush. She stood, she turned. And Richard Calloway, a man who had stared down regulatory committees, hostile shareholders, and the particular blank cruelty of a world that respects only results, felt the floor shift beneath him. Sophia, his daughter, his only child, the girl who had vanished 8 months ago without a call, without a note, without a word to anyone, who he had hired 3 separate private investigation firms to locate, who he had lain awake at 4 in the morning imagining in 1,000 terrible situations. stood in front of him wearing a maid's uniform in his own kitchen. She looked thinner than he remembered. There were shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago, and her hands, he looked at her hands almost involuntarily, were red and chapped in a way that told him this was not a situation of days. This had been going on for weeks at minimum. She met his gaze steadily. There was no flinching, no apology, but beneath the composure he could see something trembling, something she was working very hard to hold. Sophia, his voice came out wrong, too small, not the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms. What in God's name? Don't, she said quietly. Don't do the shocked face and the raised voice, just, don't, not yet. You've been here. The realization was spreading through him in waves, each one more disorienting than the last. You've been living here in this house, as, he gestured helplessly at the uniform. How long? 3 months. 3 months. He repeated it because repetition was all he had. I had investigators, Sophia, 3 firms. They said they couldn't find you. Because I didn't want to be found. She paused. Not by you, not yet. Not yet. His jaw tightened. The initial shock was beginning to calcify into something harder, something more familiar, the defensive pride of a man unaccustomed to being on the wrong side of a situation he doesn't understand. You want to explain to me why my daughter is scrubbing floors in my house under an assumed name while I've been, his voice fractured slightly. He hated it. While I've been losing my mind. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Something complicated moved through her expression, grief, resolve, something that might have been compassion, though it was edged with old pain. Yes, she said, I do want to explain, but you're going to have to sit down, Dad, and you're going to have to actually listen, not talk, not interrupt, not manage. She pulled out one of the kitchen island stools and pushed it toward him with her foot. Can you do that? Richard Calloway, $3 billion man, stood in his own kitchen and looked at his daughter's chapped hands and hollow eyes, and he sat down. Tell me, he said. And she began. She didn't start at the beginning. She started in the middle, the way people always start when they've been rehearsing something for so long that the rehearsal has a shape of its own. Do you remember the Osai family? Sophia asked. Richard's brow furrowed. The name is familiar. Kwame Osai. He was your facilities director for 11 years. He ran operations at the Bridgeport manufacturing plant. She watched his face. You terminated him 18 months ago. People are terminated, that's business. He was terminated 3 weeks before his pension fully vested. Her voice was level, but her eyes were not. After 11 years of service, he was let go based on an internal audit report that flagged him for expense account irregularities. She paused. Irregularities that didn't exist. The silence in the kitchen was long. That audit was handled by Donovan Walsh. Sophia said the name the way you drop a stone into still water, watching for the ripple. Your CFO, your business partner of 15 years, your best man at your wedding to Diana. Richard went very still. Diana, his second wife, married 4 years ago after the long loneliness following Sophia's mother's death. Diana, who was warm and beautiful and exactly what a grief-hollowed man needed to believe in again. Diana, who had inserted herself into the business with quiet, reasonable suggestions that Richard had gradually begun to rely upon. Diana, who had introduced him to Donovan Walsh 20 years ago. Keep talking, Richard said. His voice was very quiet now. Sophia had met Kwame Osai's daughter, Amma, in a support group, a fact that Richard would later find both humbling and clarifying about the width of the world his daughter inhabited versus the narrow corridor of his own. Amma Osai was 23. A nursing student who had been supporting her father and 2 younger siblings since Kwame's termination devastated the family financially. Kwame himself had fallen into a depression, so severe he'd been hospitalized twice. The family had lost their home. Amma worked double shifts and still couldn't keep them from sliding. She showed me the termination documents, Sophia said. The audit report. I know what fraudulent paperwork looks like, Dad. I grew up watching you build a company. I know what real internal documentation looks like versus something that's been manufactured after the fact. How did you know it was manufactured? Because 3 of the expense claims cited in the audit were dated during periods when the plant systems were down for maintenance. The transactions they referenced couldn't have been processed. The timestamps were wrong. She looked at him steadily. Whoever fabricated that audit was meticulous, but they made mistakes. They always do. Richard was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you come to me with this? I tried. The two words landed like an open hand. I called your office 4 times. I sent 2 emails flagged urgent. Do you know what I got back? Your executive assistant telling me you were unavailable and that if I had concerns about internal HR decisions, I should submit them through the proper channels. She exhaled. The proper channels that report to Donovan Walsh. Richard had no answer for this. It was the truth. He had been unreachable, physically present, but operationally sealed behind layers of intermediaries and structure he had built around himself in the name of efficiency. It had never occurred to him that those layers might also seal out his own daughter. So I decided to find out the truth myself, Sophia said. The right way, from the inside. The plan she had constructed alone, without resources beyond her own resourcefulness, was either the most reckless or the most impressive thing Richard had ever heard, and he genuinely couldn't decide which. She had contacted Greta through a staffing agency, using a different name. Greta, who ran the household with iron efficiency and absolute discretion, had processed her like any other domestic hire. Sophia had done her homework. She knew which shifts would put her in proximity to the home office, which schedules would be reliably empty, which of the estate's guest suites Donovan Walsh used when he stayed over on long business weekends. Because Donovan did stay over, regularly, and Sophia had noticed something she couldn't unknot. On the mornings after Donovan's overnight stays, Diana's demeanor shifted. She was lighter, more animated, and she took long private calls in the garden that ended the moment anyone approached. Dad, Sophia said, very gently now, the anger softened into something more devastating. This isn't just about Quame Osai. What they've been doing, Walsh and Diana, it goes much deeper than one man's pension. Richard's hands, resting on the kitchen island, were completely still. That total stillness was the only thing that betrayed the magnitude of what was moving through him. Show me, he said. Sophia reached into the pocket of her uniform and produced a key, a small, plain key on a simple ring. There's a locked filing box in the 3rd drawer of the guest suite armoire, she said. Diana thinks it's hers. She's had it there for 2 months. She placed the key on the marble between them. She doesn't know I had it copied. Richard looked at the key for a long time. Then he picked it up. The file box contained 47 documents. Richard read them in his study, alone, over the course of 4 hours. Sophia sat in the kitchen and waited, and the waiting was the hardest thing she had done in 8 months. Harder than the scrubbing, harder than the pretending, harder than watching the man she both loved and resented walk past her in corridors without a flicker of recognition. The documents told a story that assembled itself piece by piece, the way a sickness reveals itself slowly through accumulating symptoms. Donovan Walsh and Diana had been siphoning capital from 3 of Callaway Global's subsidiary accounts, small amounts across many transactions, a technique designed to evade automated flagging. The aggregate over 31 months was just under $18 million. Some of it had been directed into offshore accounts. Some had been used to quietly acquire equity in a competitor firm, a firm that would benefit enormously when Callaway Global's Bridgeport operation was weakened. The termination of experienced personnel like Quame Osai was not random cost-cutting. It was intentional degradation of operational capacity, weakening the plant, setting up a crisis that would make Callaway Global vulnerable, and the competing firm, in which Walsh and Diana had hidden stakes, stronger. There was also a personal element to the documents that was worse, in its way, than the financial crime. A series of private communications between Walsh and Diana, printed, evidently, from a secured server, made clear that their relationship was not professional, had not been professional for at least 3 years. Predating, Richard would later calculate with the mechanical precision of a man refusing to feel something until he has finished understanding it, his marriage to Diana by nearly a year. She had married him knowing. He sat in his study for a very long time after he finished reading. When he finally walked back to the kitchen, Sophia was still there. She had made tea. She always used to make tea when she was young and frightened, a habit she'd inherited from her mother, and there was a cup waiting for him on the island. He sat down, he picked it up. His hands were not steady. "How long have you known all of this?" he asked. "I've suspected for 4 months. I was certain for 6 weeks." She paused. "I needed more documentation before I brought it to you. I needed it to be airtight. I knew what you'd say. I knew you'd defend him. I knew you'd defend her. And if I came to you with suspicions and not proof, they'd cover their tracks and I'd never be able to protect the Osai family. I needed it to be undeniable." Richard looked at his daughter, this young woman in a gray uniform with red hands who had done in 8 months what 3 private investigations firms hadn't done, what his entire internal compliance apparatus hadn't done, what his own intuition, clouded by trust, by love, by the comfortable fog of a life insulated by wealth, hadn't done. "You could have been hurt," he said. It was the wrong thing to say, probably, but it was what came out. "I know," she said simply. "If they'd figured out who you were." "I know. Sophia." "Dad," her voice broke on the word, just slightly, just enough. "I know." Richard made 3 phone calls that evening. The first was to his attorney, Harrison Cole, who had been in Richard's corner for 22 years and who listened to a 15-minute summary of the situation, with the focused silence of a man who is simultaneously absorbing information and mentally organizing legal strategy. Cole's first response was, "Don't confront either of them yet." His second was, "I'll be there tomorrow morning at 7. The second call was to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Richard had contacts there from a previous matter years ago, and what those contacts told him, after a careful description of the documentation Sophia had gathered, was that what she had assembled was not just useful. It was exceptional, methodical, the kind of evidence package that often took investigators months to construct. The special agent he spoke with asked twice how it had been gathered. Richard said, "My daughter," and left it at that. The third call Richard made was the hardest. He called Kwame Osai. He got the number from Sophia, who gave it to him without comment. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered, a voice rough with something that wasn't just age, the particular roughness of someone who has been through extended suffering and is no longer surprised by difficulty. "Mr. Osai," Richard said, "my name is Richard Calloway." There was a silence so total and so charged that Richard felt it in his chest. "I know who you are," Kwame Osai said at last. The words were perfectly level, perfectly controlled, the control of someone who has had this confrontation in their head 1,000 times. "I owe you an apology," Richard said, "and I owe you the truth. And then I owe you considerably more than that, and I would like to speak to you about all of it, if you'll allow me." Another silence, then quietly, "I'm listening." By the next morning, the mechanism was in motion. Harrison Cole arrived at 7 with 2 associates. The FBI made their own quiet inquiries. Richard had surveillance on his own estate, arranged through means that Harrison strongly advised him not to specify to anyone. And at 11:15 that morning, Diana returned from what she described the previous evening as a shopping trip, and Donovan Walsh arrived 40 minutes later under the pretense of reviewing quarterly projections. They were not expecting Richard to be home. They were not expecting the 2 federal agents in the study. They were certainly not expecting the file box, its contents professionally duplicated and documented, to be open on Richard's desk. Richard would describe that confrontation later to Sophia in sparse, careful terms, the way you describe witnessing something you cannot fully process, the way Walsh's composure had simply dropped, like a curtain, like a man whose particular talent for projection and performance suddenly had no audience willing to receive it. The way Diana had looked in that first instant, not guilty but calculating, running futures, measuring exits, assessing what could still be salvaged. And then, when the reality penetrated, that calculation collapsing into something that might have been shame, though Richard honestly could not tell from the inside. He didn't say much in that room. He had decided, the previous night, that this was not a moment for speeches. He had given enough speeches. He had used words as instruments of power for long enough to know that they were also instruments of distance, that the person who speaks most in a room is often the person most afraid of what silence will reveal. He let the agents do their work. He walked out. He found Sophia in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the old oak at the property's edge, the bench where her mother used to sit in the evenings, reading. He had not seen Sophia visit that bench in years. He had not visited it himself in longer. He sat beside her without speaking. The autumn light was thin and pale and very clean, the way light gets in October when everything extraneous has been stripped away, and only the essential remains. "Is it done?" she asked. "The first part," he said. She nodded. "Quame Osa is going to be all right," Richard said. "It's going to take time to untangle everything, but Cole is already working on full restitution, the pension, the back pay, damages. There will be a civil suit as well against Walsh specifically. He has personal assets that aren't covered under corporate indemnity." He paused. "His family will be taken care of. I'm going to make sure of that." Sophia didn't respond immediately. She was looking at the oak tree, at the way the light filtered through its last leaves. "Amma is going to finish her nursing degree," she said. "Not a question, more like a decision. I'll see to it personally." She nodded again, exhaled. "How are you?" he asked. It was such a simple question, such an inadequate question. He asked it anyway because he had spent too many years asking the complicated questions, the strategic questions, the consequential questions, and deferring the simple ones until they had accumulated into a silence so large it had swallowed his daughter for 8 months. Sophia turned to look at him, and for the first time since he had walked into that kitchen the afternoon before, since the shock and the revelation and the forensic unspooling of betrayal, the composure she had held like armor around herself began to ease. Not collapse, ease, like a fist slowly opening. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm really, really tired." Richard did something he hadn't done since she was small enough to fit entirely in the space beside him on a bench. He put his arm around his daughter and held her. She let him. The weeks that followed were not easy, and Richard would not have trusted them if they had been. Donovan Walsh was charged on 7 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Diana faced charges of conspiracy and fraud. The legal machinery moved with the unhurried inevitability of institutional consequence, and Richard, who had spent his career attempting to control every outcome, discovered something strange about stepping back and allowing justice to operate without his interference. It was uncomfortable, and it was correct, and those two things coexisted in him like a lesson he had needed for a long time. The board of Callaway Global called an emergency meeting. Richard appeared with Harrison Cole and the documentation and gave a full accounting of what had occurred inside his company, on his watch, under the cover of his trust. It was the hardest 2 hours of his professional life, harder than the 2009 restructuring, harder than testifying before a regulatory panel in 2015, because it required him to be comprehensively accountable for the conditions that had allowed the betrayal to flourish. The insularity, the hierarchy that reported to itself, the way his wealth had insulated him not just from inconvenience but from truth. He did not deflect, he did not qualify. The board voted to retain him, barely, and Richard felt the nearness of that vote as appropriate. Quame Osai came to the estate 3 weeks after the arrests. Richard had suggested meeting at his office, or at a restaurant, or anywhere that might carry less psychological weight than the property of the man who had effectively dismantled his life. Quame had said calmly that he preferred the estate, that he wanted to see it, that there was something he needed to understand about the place from which the damage had originated, as if geography could complete a story that documents alone could not. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray at his temples and hands that looked like they'd been built for work and had done it. He walked through the entrance with the bearing of someone who has decided, as a practice rather than a feeling, to proceed with dignity regardless of circumstance. Richard recognized that bearing. He had tried to cultivate it himself, with varying success. They sat in the garden, not Richard's usual meeting space, but the garden felt right, felt like something less armored, and they talked for nearly 2 hours. Quame spoke about the year after the termination, the disorientation of a man whose identity had been constructed around reliability and performance suddenly having both repudiated. The way his children had tried to shelter him from knowing how bad things were financially, and how he had known anyway, and the knowing without being able to help had been the worst part. The hospitalization, the slow climb back. He didn't say these things with the intent to wound. He said them because they were true and because, he told Richard, he had spent long enough carrying them alone. Richard listened. He did not manage the conversation. He did not redirect it toward resolution or forward motion. He sat with the weight of what he was hearing and let it settle fully before he spoke. "There is nothing I can say," Richard told him, "that repairs what happened to you. Everything I'm doing, the restitution, the settlement, is right and it's necessary and it's still inadequate. I know that. I want you to know that I know it." Quame was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "What I needed more than anything was for someone to say the words, that it was wrong, not that mistakes were made, not that circumstances led to outcomes, that what was done to me was wrong and that somebody with the power to say so is willing to say it plainly." "It was wrong," Richard said. "What was done to you was wrong. I failed you. The failure was mine." Quame Osei nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long time. "Then your daughter is something else, Mr. Calloway." Richard's jaw moved. "Yes," he said, "she is. Amma calls her every day." Something almost like warmth moved through Quame's expression, guarded but present. "Whatever she went through to get to this point, whatever the two of them did together, I think they'll be friends for a long time." "I think so too." Sophia stayed. That surprised Richard more than almost anything else. More than the evidence, more than the confrontation, more than the legal aftermath that continued to generate paperwork and press inquiries and bored anxiety for months. He had not assumed she would leave exactly, but he had not assumed she would stay either. They had too much history, too much calcified silence, too much of the particular damage that accumulates between people who love each other and are too proud, or too afraid, or too constituted for silence to say so clearly enough. But she stayed. She moved back into her old room, which had been kept exactly as she'd left it, a fact she noted with an expression that moved through surprise into something more complicated and more tender. She began working formally with the Calloway Global Foundation, specifically on labor equity and employee protection initiatives. She was not doing it as a favor. She was doing it because she was good at it, and because it mattered to her, and because, she told her father, she was not interested in inheriting a company, unless it was one she'd had a hand in making worth inheriting. Richard did not object to any of this. He found, somewhat to his astonishment, that he was incapable of objecting to it. Something had shifted in him in the kitchen of his own house, standing before his daughter with her chapped hands and her carefully constructed composure. Some calcification he had not known was there had broken open, and what came through was not weakness but a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't require control in order to feel secure. They had dinners together on Thursday evenings. Not by formal arrangement, it evolved, the way real things evolve rather than being structured into existence. Sophia would drift toward the kitchen around 7, and Richard would follow, and they would cook together in the large professional kitchen where this story had begun, where the truth had cracked open between them like an egg. They talked, not always easily. There were evenings weighted with old grievance, things said in that last terrible dinner 2 years ago that needed to be examined and accounted for and sat with. Richard had said things in anger that he could not unsay and could only acknowledge. Sophia had carried pain that she could not simply release on schedule. They were not a television family, reconciled by revelation and sentiment. They were two people who had inherited from each other in equal measure a tremendous capacity for both love and stubborn silence, and were trying, with considerable effort and mixed results, to choose the former. It was enough, it was more than enough. The day Richard formally announced Quame Osei's appointment as Director of Operations Integrity at Calloway Global, a newly created position with genuine authority over internal compliance and employee advocacy. Sophia stood in the back of the boardroom and watched. She had not told Richard she was coming. He saw her when the announcement concluded, over the heads of the assembled board and the small number of invited guests, and his face did something that she would not be able to describe precisely later when Amma asked her about it. It was not just pride. It was not just relief. It was the specific expression of a man seeing, perhaps for the first time in a long time, the clearest version of who he could be, reflected back to him by someone he loved. She raised an eyebrow at him, the old gesture, the childhood gesture that said, "Well, are you watching?" He smiled, the real one, the one that went all the way to his eyes. She had always been able to make him do that. That evening, sitting on her mother's bench in the October garden, the light thin and clean and particular to this season. And this place, Sophia thought about hope, about what it actually looks like, unsentimentalized and without its cinematic gloss. It doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a key copied in secret. Sometimes it looks like rubber gloves and a scrubbing brush, and a gray uniform worn by a young woman who understood that the truth is never going to come to you, that you have to go and find it. Get on your hands and knees and excavate it from the places where it has been deliberately buried. Sometimes love looks like that too. Not the easy expression of it, but the hard, patient, inconvenient work of it. The refusal to leave, even when leaving would be simpler. The insistence on staying close enough to the truth and to the person to still have a chance. Her father came and sat beside her, as she had known he would. They didn't speak immediately. They were learning, both of them, the difference between silence that is absence and silence that is presence. This was the second kind. "Thank you," Richard said eventually. He meant it to cover everything and he suspected it didn't. But he said it anyway because the right words and the available words are not always the same, and sometimes you offer what you have. Sophia leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, just long enough. "Be worth thanking," she said. And the pale October light lay across the garden, and the old oak held its last leaves against the autumn wind, and somewhere in the city, a family who had been broken was beginning, carefully, to mend. "So let me ask you something." When Sophia put on that uniform and got on her hands and knees in her own father's kitchen, not because she had to, but because someone else's family was depending on her finding the truth, what did you feel? Because I'll tell you what I felt. I felt the kind of anger that only comes when you see someone do the right thing in a world that keeps rewarding people who do the wrong thing. And then I felt something else, something rarer. I felt hope. We live in a world that can feel like the Donovan Walshes always win. Like the people with access and influence, and the ability to bury the truth always stay 3 steps ahead. But this story and stories like it, real stories, human stories, remind us that one person with enough courage and enough love and enough patience to stay in the room can change everything. Sophia didn't have an army. She had a key and a notebook and a gray uniform and the refusal to walk away. That's it. And she moved mountains. If this story hit you somewhere real, if it made you angry at the right things, or gave you back a little faith in people, or reminded you why it matters to show up even when no one is watching, then smash that like button right now. Not for the algorithm, for Sophia, for Quame, for every person who has been quietly doing the hard, invisible work of making things right. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was the moment that broke you in this story? Was it Richard finding her on the floor, the copied key, the phone call to Quame? Tell me. I read every single comment. If you are new here, welcome. This channel is where we tell the stories that deserve to be told. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. And share this. Share it with one person who needs to believe today that the truth still matters. That doing the right thing, the slow, unglamorous, costly, real right thing still means something. There are more stories coming. Stories that will make you feel exactly this, maybe more. You are not alone in caring about this. This community proves it every single day. See you in the next one.